Okay, for all intents and purposes, this chapter and the concept of revising, shining the diamond of your rough draft, uh, and turning it into a diamond is actually the most important part of the writing process, as far as I'm concerned. Uh, and I know that some people don't think that, especially those of you who may procrastinate and write your essays at the very last minute, which is what I used to do. I never thought I revised my papers. But the thing is, when I was young and had a good memory still, uh, I would write all my papers in my head. And so I'd be the guy you'd see walking across campus talking to himself, because what I was doing as I walked from home to class or between classes and a paper was due, I'd be revising it in my head. I could literally keep a 10-page paper in my head, word for word, and then just sit down and type it out. So I always felt like I was just turning in my first draft. But my first draft, even though it was the first thing I actually typed, it wasn't my first draft. My first draft had been made in my head, and all sorts of revisions had been made prior to the paper being done. If you can do that, great. If you're like most human beings, you don't have that type of memory, especially as you get the longer papers, then you need to write out a rough draft and give yourself enough time to actually then uh, revise the paper properly. All right, so what isn't revising? And this is another problem people have. People think when they edit or proofread a paper, so fix the grammar mistakes, fix the spelling mistakes, that's revising. That is not revising. I had a guy who went to grad school with me who I thought was a good writer. He's written 6 or 7 novels now and has had none of them published except for the one that his wife, his lawyer wife, who created and founded her own publishing company just to publish his one novel so he could say he's published. No real publisher would take him on. And the reason is he thinks he's revising when as he goes through his writing, as he's writing, he goes back and fixes minor things and then he thinks he's done. And that's not revising. So what is revising the essay on a grand scale. So what you're doing is you're taking paragraphs out. You're adding paragraphs in. You are switching paragraphs around, helping the logical coherence, rewriting paragraphs so that all the sentences support the topic sentence and every sentence logically follows the one prior. And all good writers revise again and again. Uh, I've read a number of interviews with fiction writers since, that's my interest. And even Raymond Carver, who's a horrible alcoholic, I mean, terrible alcoholic, drunk all the time, he never submitted any story to his editor that he hadn't revised at least 6 times completely. So this is where the real writing, and it's the hard part. One of the reasons I think my fiction is not published is I'm very good at revising academic papers. I was excellent at that. I'm not real good at revising fiction. I have a hard time with that. But I know people who, are very good at it and they're published. One of the guys in my writing group in grad school, his first novel was published and then turned into a movie. But he was great at revising. All right, so prepare and revise. What's the first thing you must do? It's a trick question. You have to write something. If you don't have an essay to revise, what do you revise? All right. So again, it's the big picture. It's not the small stuff. Uh, you may want to use what's called the FACT approach. This acronym, I'm having been in the Navy, or anyone who's been in the military really gets tired of acronyms because they use acronyms for everything. But if it works for you, then great. So what you're looking for, does everything fit together? So there you're looking at the logical coherence of the essay. Does paragraph B naturally follow A? Does C follow B? Should C maybe go before B? That type of thing. Do you need to add anything? Do you not have enough support in a certain area? And so you need to add. Or on a smaller scale, Does your paragraph not have enough support for the topic sentence of the paragraph? Do you need to add a sentence or two that gives it a little bit more support? Does anything need to be cut? Now, this is the little more difficult one for people because in fiction we call it killing your babies. So, what we mean by that is you've written this excellent character. You love this character. It's one of the best characters you've ever written. You just think he or she's the best character I mean, it's so full and there's so much depth to the character and the character's so realistic and interesting, but you realize the character isn't really adding anything to the story. Well, you got to kill that baby. Sorry, no matter how much you like the character isn't helping your fiction. So with you, what it's going to be is you have a paragraph that doesn't really support your thesis or your claim. And the problem is it's a 3 to 5 page paper and you only have 3 pages. Well, if I cut this paragraph, I'll only have 2.5 pages. And so you don't want to do it, but you've got to do it. You're better off not having enough page length, but everything supporting the thesis, than having enough page length meeting the 3 page minimum and having half a page just be tap dancing BS. And then once you've done all of that, you have to test the organization again. Again, does everything fit together properly? All right, now specifically, you want to make sure your thesis is precise. So as I've mentioned in another lecture, you don't just want to tell me, I'm going to take a trip from Detroit to LA. Well, that doesn't tell me anything. Tell me I'm going to take a trip from Detroit to LA. I'm going June 16th. I plan to get to LA by June 21st. I'm taking Route 66 for part of the route, and I'm going to stop in Las Vegas to lose all my money for one night. That's a little bit more precise. So I'm just saying, so there are many similarities between uh, studio speakers and stereo speakers, but there's differences as well. That's kind of vague. So you could say something like there are many similarities between studio speakers and stereo speakers, such as both having subwoofer and woofer, both come in various sizes and wattage, but there are differences also, as one is more tuned for listening to high-end music and the other is tuned more for listening to the low end of music. So that's more precise. Does it communicate your main point? Make sure your thesis really says what your paper is going to be about. Make sure each paragraph supports the thesis. You don't want to see on your paper that I've written unity next to a paragraph saying this paragraph really is not supporting the paper at all. It's extraneous. It doesn't need to be in here. Make sure everything supports the thesis. Do you need to reorganize the paragraphs? Is it not organized in the most logical manner? Do people have to make big leaps to figure out where the connections are between the paragraphs? Do you have a good title? Don't give me a title like, Samsung versus iPhone. That's kind of generic, but Xbox versus PlayStation, the big smackdown. That's a little bit better. Not a lot, but somewhat better. Have an interesting title. Make sure your introduction is interesting. Make sure that it gives any background information that you need. Make sure that it draws the reader in, that you have some type of hook, and make sure your concluding paragraph actually concludes and wraps the paper up. When the reader reads that concluding paragraph, there should be no doubt we're at the end of the paper. Design we don't care about. All right, annotating. So for me, and this is because I'm old, through high school and my first years of college before I dropped out, not when I came back, but when I dropped out in the mid 80s, you used a typewriter. There was no word processing. Word processors were just coming into existence and they were the size of a washing machine back in 1983 when I dropped out of college. So I always use a hard copy. You may not need to. Most of you, if not all of you, have grown up with computers. You've always used computers. If you're good with that, then do that. The reason I like it is I can cross things out and I can cross things out lightly. However, in Word, when you cross something out, you can still fairly well read it. So it's not that big. But I can also use arrows to rearrange. I like being able to have a hard copy so that, yeah, this paragraph, I'm going to use this arrow here and move it up here. Uh, I can also mark where I want to add or material. So you don't when you're revising, you don't want to stop in the middle and start making changes. You want to notate where the changes are going to come, go through the entire essay, and then come back and make the changes. So adding letters, you can very quickly add A, and then on a separate sheet of paper write A and a quick note of what it is you want to add there. But again, whatever works for you. Just do what works for you. All right, now editing. Here we are at the small part. So editing and proofreading is part of the revising process, but it's not the only part. So with editing, you want to make sure each sentence says what you mean. I have people that have got very good write essays for me that have very good ideas, but their sentences don't say what they want to say. You want clarity in your sentences. You don't want your reader to have to figure out what it is you're trying to communicate. That means the reader has to work at figuring out your paper. That's poor writing. You want to make sure you have sentences of various lengths. So what I mean by this is you want to be careful that they aren't all the same length and the same type, because what you get is this da-dun, 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 da-dun. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. You'll put the reader to sleep if you write like that. That's what we use, why we read nursery rhymes to children at night. It puts them to sleep. You don't want your reading to put your reader to sleep, your writing. All right, do you have repeated openings? Now you got to kind of watch this, especially if you tend to write the way you speak. We don't realize that, but I mean, I notice it when I do these PowerPoints, is that I tend to start uh, my speaking on each slide a little similar to the last slide. I use okay an awful lot to begin. You got to make sure you're not doing that in your writing. Make sure that you aren't repeating the same openings over and over again. Is the tone the one you wish? We'll do a separate lecture on tone, but that is until much later in the semester. By tone, I mean, are the words you're using conveying how you want to be viewed communicating about this? So the example I always use is a neutral tone is the child crossed the room. You're just making a statement of fact that the child crossed the room. But if you say something, the brat screamed across the room, not only are you saying that the child is probably going wildly, you're also reflecting your attitude towards children possibly by using the word brat, right? So that's an extreme example, but your tone throughout your paper should be reflecting a fairly objective, not necessarily neutral tone, but objective and balanced. All right. And does any word seem awkward? You'll see me write AWK on top of papers a lot. And it just means if I can figure out a better way to say it quickly, which I don't do as fast as I used to do as I'm getting older, I just write AWK if I can't figure something out. It just seems like a better word would have gone here. Then denotation and connotation kind of relates to the tone. Denotation is the definition of the word. Are you using the proper word? So are you using affect or affect? EFF or AFF? So to affect something is AFF. The effect of something is EFF. You want to make sure you're using the correct word as far as its definition and connotation. So again, child and brat are synonyms, but one has a much more neutral, less negative connotation than brat does. And again, do you have the same word popping up again and again? When I teach this on ground, I underline those twice. And when you see things underlined in red twice throughout a paragraph, and there's 6 things that are the same word underlined, it pops out real quickly. So you just got to look for that as well. All right, finally, the proofreading, the really small stuff, looking for grammar errors, looking for spelling mistakes. I highly recommend, and you won't understand what I'm saying, but anyway, read the essay backwards. And what I mean by that, read the last sentence. Read the next to the last sentence. Read the second to the next to the last sentence. Read the third. Go backwards sentence, one sentence at a time. The reason for that is you throw your brain off. Because if you wrote, he was fro the amendment, Word is not going to catch fro as being misspelled because that's a word, to and fro. However, you will find, and they've done studies on this, and I've seen it happen in marketing when I worked in Silicon Valley for marketing and for an internet company. Uh, your mind will fix that before you actually get. Your eye will see fro, but your mind will see for because your brain is so incredibly ingenious. It will realize, wait a minute, fro can't be correct, so I'm changing it to making this myself see for. And that's why you want to read it backwards. It'll throw that off and make it harder for the brain because the brain will be a little lost, like, wait a minute, this isn't making sense. And so you'll see a mistake like that. And then finally, I really suggest doing this. Read your essay out loud. I didn't think this was such a big deal till I started writing fiction, and I was told that by a teacher because I would write this wonderful dialogue, and I thought it was fine. And then I would read it out loud and it'd be, "Hello, Sally. How are you?" "I'm fine, John. How are you?" "I am fine too, Sally. How is your husband?" "Oh, my husband is good, John. How is your husband?" I'd be like, "Oh my God, that's just horrible. That's horrible." And a lot of times and you'll realize that it's not very smooth what you've written, such as that dialogue. You'll also, if you have issues with comma splices or run-ons, you're more likely to catch them reading the essay out loud than reading it to yourself. All right, so that's it. That's a fairly long lecture, but again, it's a really important lecture. Revising is your biggest part of writing good essays. If you just throw in your first rough draft, it's not going to be that great, even if you're a great writer.